Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, hey guys, how's it going? Good. No, I hope you're doing well. If not, you'll be good soon. Do not worry. Okay, we're doing the North Sea Tsunami, Britain's deadliest disaster. Original link to the video at the top of the description below. Right below that, link to the Discord. And right below that, link to my second channel, Mr. McJibbin, where I do more non-history related stuff. When it comes to the Discord, guys, click on it. I'll send you right over there. Love to have you. Even if you're not on it, doesn't mean you're not part of the family or anything. But so I have... Wait, you can't see this. Watch. I'll work my magic here. Boom. So if you do join, if you go to the left-hand side, you see all these things. Down here are the history, sports, comedy stuff. And now that I'm a little more... I still sort of consider myself at the beginning of my YouTube career. I don't intend on stopping anytime soon. Thank you guys for the 15K subs, by the way. That's insane. Thank you so much. Yeah, but earlier on, I couldn't wait to put out as much videos as I could, and I was so happy, and you couldn't stop me from doing it. And now that I've had more of, I have sort of a base viewers, I guess, you guys, I feel more comfortable, and I just have more fun just making 2, maybe 3 videos total a day, maybe 2 on my main channel, 1 on my second channel. And yeah, so I'll be going into more of these recommendations when I wake up and decide what I want to do. So I think I'm trying to find this balance between, let's be real, all right? I can be a very lazy person, all right? Sometimes I just want to get up and react to what I want to react to, but at the same time, the channel is also, I want to react to stuff that you guys want me to react to as I grow. So I will be looking here more. Let's go. Let's do it. If you are not ready to learn, there is the door, my friend. You're in the wrong class. Home ec is down the hall. Say hello to Mrs. Eaton. That was actually the home ec teacher in high school. All right. Yeah. So, yeah, get out. Or just sit and chill in the back. Let's go. What's this? No. A vast antivirus. Okay, go.
It's the deadliest natural disaster in British history. Roughly 8,000 years ago, a gigantic submarine landslide off the coast of Scandinavia triggered a tsunami the likes of which Europe had never seen. In an instant, enough sediment collapsed to bury the whole of Scotland to a depth of 8 meters. So much water was displaced that
What do you mean the whole of Scotland? Are you telling me that the average elevation of Scotland dropped 8 meters, or are you saying that the highest point of Scotland was covered by 8 meters of water? I don't...
It created a vast wave which came crashing into Britain at 80 miles per hour, reaching up to 40 meters high. The water obliterated everything in its path. Rivers and estuaries were inundated. Entire coastal communities were just swept away. It's estimated that up to a quarter of Britain's Mesolithic population died, making it, per capita, the deadliest disaster in British history. And yet Britain wasn't even the worst affected region. That honour would go to the now lost area that's been called Northern Europe's...
What's the worst natural disaster in human history? Is it like a volcano or something?
Atlantis. That honour would go to the now lost area that's been called Northern Europe's Atlantis, Doggerland. A lush, low-lying plain connecting Britain to the mainland, Doggerland was the closest the Mesolithic world had to an Eden. But when the tsunami hit, it would become ground zero for a catastrophe beyond imagination. Join us today as we explore both the lost world of Doggerland and Britain's prehistoric apocalypse.
That's what you meant. Someone said, I didn't know what you were talking about. Europe's lost island or country or something like that. Okay, you were being literal. Sit back and enjoy. No pauses.
Picture in your head a map of Northern Europe. You can probably conjure its most famous features with ease. Denmark poking out of the top of Germany, Scandinavia looking weirdly like some guy's leprosy-afflicted genitals, and of course Britain and Ireland floating apart from the rest, defiantly doing their own thing. Got that? Well, now we're going to take that map and move it back in time, all the way back to the end of the last ice age. The northern Europe you'd see back then would look completely different. During the last ice age, Europe's sea level was a staggering 122 meters lower. Instead of a separate Britain and Ireland, you just had one gigantic clump of land attached to the rest of Europe by a swath of desolate, scrub-filled tundra. This tundra was essentially uninhabited, until, that is, the world began warming as the ice sheet slowly retreated.
So the water in between Great Britain and Ireland must be pretty deep in order to still not be connected after this is.
A swath of pushed north following the began warming as the ice sheet slowly retreated. Prehistoric humans pushed north following the wild animals. To their presumed surprise, they soon found themselves in an ancient paradise. Where the tundra had once stood, now lay a vast, low plain teeming with life. In this warming world, one slightly warmer than today, there would have been forests, lakes, valleys, lagoons, meadows, estuaries. Wild berries grew in abundance alongside hazelnuts and other foods that were perfect for foraging. Animals grazed along the shorelines while the waters teemed with fish. Today we call this lost world Doggerland, but for Mesolithic Europeans, it probably had a different name. For around 100,000 ancient humans, it was simply known as home. Not that the migration stopped at Doggerland.
What does Doggerland mean?
Just as the plain became home to scattered settlements, so too did the island of Britain. Of course, it wasn't actually an island then, even as the melting ice sheet slowly revealed its modern contours. For thousands more years, Britain would be attached to Europe via Doggerland, no more separate than Italy is today. But whether the migrants settled on the plain or in Britain itself, one thing is certain. For these hunter-gatherers, it would have been a time of plenty. Compared to our mental images of the Stone Age as a time where dudes lived in caves and hit each other on the head with clubs, life in this ancient lands would have been surprisingly sophisticated. People likely lived in semi-permanent camps of perhaps 10 to a few dozen people, keeping to the shores and estuaries in the fall and winter and heading inland to hunt during the summer. These camps would be moved and rebuilt as needed, allowing for a near-nomadic lifestyle. But nomadic doesn't mean unadvanced. We have evidence of boat building, tool making, and even the construction of ancient wooden slipways. And this last one is important as it suggests Mesolithic Britons and Doggerlanders spent more time cooperating than they did fighting over who had the best loincloth.
You know what's crazy, guys? I listened to everything you said, but something just came up that I want to say. How far back would you have to go? So humans evolved, right? Like any other animal. Again, you can change my opinion on anything, but that one's pretty firm. But how far back would you have to go in order to find a person who, like if you brought them today as a baby and they grew up in normal society, there would be like something off about them, you know, because you'd have to go back maybe 500,000 years or something, maybe even 1,000,000 years. You know what I mean? Because at a certain point, a human must have not seemed like a human. Does that make sense?
Evidence has even been uncovered of annual social events when all the region's tribes would gather, often on low cliffs overlooking sealing grounds. Aside from an excuse to hold the Stone Age equivalent of Glastonbury Festival, these gatherings would have also allowed the young to find mates. They would have likely been storytelling too. With no written language, these bygone cultures would have had oral traditions telling a whole cycle of now lost stories about their forgotten gods. In short, this was a vibrant world with complex societies interacting over hundreds of kilometers. Sadly, it would be these humans that bore the brunt of the coming disaster. Even before the tsunami struck, there were signs that this whole warming world thing was changing Doggerland's fortunes. A few millennia before, most of the northern hemisphere had been buried under ice, including Canada and America. Now, as that ice thawed, those places were experiencing dramatic changes. Over in the modern US, so much meltwater came off the glaciers that it formed a gigantic lake known as Lake Agassiz. In fact,
Hudson Bay is so crazy. It's such a giant bay, but because it's so far north, it's so insignificant. Anyway, sorry.
The word gigantic doesn't really do it justice. Lake Agassiz was bigger than all of today's Great Lakes combined, closer in size to the Black Sea than Lake Superior. When it finally burst its banks, the whole world knew about it. Around 6200 BC, Lake Agassiz sent all of its water flooding out into the North Atlantic. Over in ancient Europe, this sudden influx of water caused the sea level to noticeably rise, and with that rise came some dramatic changes. See, Lake Agassiz disrupted the Atlantic circulation of warm water, causing temperatures to drop. For Doggerland, that meant a 1-2 punch of vanishing coastline and sudden cold winds pummeling its shores. The result was a land no longer such a paradise, one where fertile land was replaced by marshes and jagged coastline. As Doggerland shrank, so too did Britain's physical connection to mainland Europe. Within maybe a century, all that remained was a narrow land bridge and a scattering of low-lying, swampy islands. Yet this wasn't the end of the region. While the changes were bad for some, it allowed others to thrive, those who transitioned to a life ever more based around fishing and boat building. For some, the changes were probably beneficial. Sadly, rising sea levels weren't the only changes the retreating glaciers were producing. Off the coasts of modern Norway, shifts were underway that would soon spell doom for Mesolithic Britain. Far beneath the seabed, huge chambers of long-frozen methane were beginning to thaw. This methane had been frozen solid during the Ice Age, but the warming world turned it back into a gas. Since it was still trapped underground, this transformation was hugely destabilizing for Norway's continental shelf. Unfortunately, even as things grew less stable underground, they became shaky above ground too. As the glaciers once covering Scandinavia retreated, they'd taken untold cubic kilometers of ice with them. Since ice is really heavy, this meant the ground above Norway was suddenly no longer being pressed down on, just as gas started bubbling up like crazy below it. Today, scientists believe this combination led to major earthquakes. And at some point, in 6200 BC, the biggest earthquake yet struck. The Storegga slide remains the third biggest known submarine slide in history. Over just a few hours, nearly 300 kilometers of continental shelf collapsed, displacing...
I thought earthquakes are caused by tectonic plates being moved because of the magma underneath it and the pressures there. How does something on the surface influence or start an earthquake? Another thing, so as you probably realize, I'm interested in everything, but I'm an expert in nothing. And climate change is one of those things. But it always seems like whenever climate changes, it's always for the worse. And that just doesn't really make sense to me, because maybe it's just because any change to what we're doing now is going to cause disruption and mess with people's lifestyle. But it just seems like, the environment doesn't care what happens to it, Like, the environment is going to change, and whatever it changes, it doesn't care. It's not a living thing. And so is there ever a point where it's like, whoa, the climate change, look at that. It's amazing here now. It seems like it always is just like, it's just bad.
3,000 cubic kilometers of debris. Had a slip this size somehow happened on land, it would have been enough to bury the whole of Scotland. Underwater, though, it instead displaced an unimaginable amount of seawater. As we saw with the Indian Ocean in 2004 and Japan in 2011, such displaced seawater doesn't just make a bit of a splash and then resettle on the surface. It creates a wave, a rushing, powerful, overwhelming wall of water that radiates out in all directions, sweeping across the oceans until it finally crashes up against land. In tsunami-prone cultures like Japan, these waves happen often enough that the natives try to prepare for them, even in ancient times. But Europe isn't a place regularly exposed to tsunamis. At the moment the Storegga slide sent its annihilating wave shooting out across the water, it's unlikely anyone in Britain or Doggerland had any idea that the sea was capable of such a thing. If that's the case, they were in for a rude awakening. Although no one could have known it at the time, Britain was about to experience the deadliest day in its entire history. The key thing that made the North Sea tsunami so deadly is the time of year it occurred. Thanks to ancient fruit stones discovered in the layers of sediment it left behind, we know the tsunami must have landed in autumn. The most likely estimate is around late October. This was a problem because autumn was when Mesolithic peoples returned from their summers hunting on higher ground to settle in beside the coast for winter. Although Britain's population is thought to have been a mere 50,000 at this time, nearly all of them were concentrated in coastal areas, most of which were on the east coast, aka exactly exactly where a giant killer wave was about to hit. In Doggerland, it was even worse. Nearly entirely low-lying Doggerland was like the Netherlands without its seawalls, flood defences, or excellent cheese. A flat space, a spilled pint of beer could probably inundate. This meant most of its inhabitants stood a roughly zero chance of surviving what came next. Obviously, since there were no written records at this time, we don't know exactly what the catastrophe looked like, but we can guess. If it occurred in the daytime, there were likely primitive boats just offshore, fires burning outside.
Guys, so this, I must have been talking over it. So this wasn't so much an earthquake in the traditional sense that caused a tsunami, and it was caused by thawing ice and therefore thawing ground, which wasn't so pressurized, and massive landslides in Norway that caused this giant wave to go forward.
Stone Age tents. Maybe people were working, maybe they were playing or eating or in the middle of some ritual. Maybe neighbors were simply sat together gossiping while they kept one eye on their children. Whatever the truth, there's no ambiguity about what came next. Up in the Shetland Islands off Scotland's northern tip, these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have all fallen silent, stopped what they were doing as the sea mysteriously vanished. In an instant, the waters would have retreated, pulling far back, exposing shore that likely hadn't seen daylight since Lake Agassiz came pouring into the Atlantic. Today,
I wonder if that's how they thought the Earth was flat, or what? Because, well, then the tsunami would come. Because it almost looks like, oh, wow, a side must have broken, and now all the ocean is falling off the side onto God's foot or something.
most of us know that this is nature's way of telling you to run like hell.
Yeah.
But no one in Mesolithic Britain could have known this.
Like, oh, look, the water
likely just
retreating.
watched, puzzled, maybe scared as the sea did something they'd never seen it do before. Somewhere between a few seconds
Right.
and a few minutes
You're
later,
probably more like, no.
the horror began. A wave up to 40 meters high came crashing in at a speed of 35 meters per second. At such speeds, water feels less like how you'd expect it to feel and more like a moving,
wall.
churning, boiling wall of concrete. Those on the shore may have just had enough time to realize they were dead before it struck, sweeping entire coastal communities away. After that, it was the rest of Britain's turn.
I mean, you must
Maiden
not
and
die on
Scotland's was
contact.
next to be hit, with a 20-meter wave crashing into its east coast. Maiden and Scotland's was next to be hit, with a 20-meter wave crashing into its east coast. Estuaries and rivers helped funnel the devastation inland, wiping out fishing communities that were a whole day's travel from the sea. Evidence from the Forth River shows the waters might have cascaded over 30 kilometers into the interior, causing devastation the entire way. This was a pattern that repeated over and over as the wave reached modern England. Valleys filled with water, estuaries were inundated, marshlands flooded. But the worst was reserved for Doggerland.
I'm cold. Sorry, guys. Okay, I was cold. All right,
Geographical
where
equivalent
was I
of a
here?
flat the entire way. Valleys filled with water, estuaries were inundated, marshlands flooded. But the worst was reserved for Doggerland. Being the geographical equivalent of a flat tabletop, Doggerland didn't stand a chance. The wave simply washed over it, drowning everything in its path. Of Doggerland's estimated population of 100,000, it's unknown how many could have possibly survived. Overall, the wave inundated nearly 7,000 square kilometers of Britain, equivalent to the whole
miles.
of Delaware sinking beneath the waves. Sadly,
I forget how much bigger Delaware is than Rhode Island, but it is the second smallest state. So
this was just the warm-up act. Over the next few hours, two more powerful tsunamis crashed into the devastated coastal communities, killing who knows how many ancient first responders. By the time the last wave ended its path of destruction, East Britain and Doggerland had been devastated. Our best estimates suggest that around 12,000 people lost their lives in Britain, with untold more dying in Doggerland. Even today, this grim tally would make it one of the deadliest natural disasters to ever strike Britain. Adjusted for population, it stands second to none. Only the Black Death in the 14th century killed a larger percentage of Britons. And still, the tsunami's effects weren't over.
is that a
In
dog
fact,
eating a person?
century killed a larger percentage of Britons. And still, the tsunami's effects weren't over. In fact, its victims would be living with them for centuries to come. Generally, when a large-scale disaster strikes the modern world, there are agents.
Can I just say how happy we should be, guys? All right. Nowadays, I feel like happiness is based on expectations. And so I think no matter how perfect you make whatnot, but at least we don't have to deal with this stuff and that horrible Black Death image. Just wanted to give a little thing of hope in this dark video, okay?
Generally, when a large-scale disaster strikes the modern world, there are agencies like FEMA on standby to stop the aftermath becoming even worse than the actual cataclysm. Of course, this doesn't always pan out, as anyone living in New Orleans in 2005 could tell you, but there's usually at least an attempt.
2005, so I was 12.
At disaster relief, an effort to alleviate suffering. Sadly, the Mesolithic world didn't work like this. After the trio of tsunamis had battered them senseless, the prehistoric Britons were left to fend for themselves. Not only did they have to deal with a death toll unlike anything they'd ever seen, but also the loss of everything that they'd held dear. Camps would have been swept away, along with any food the inhabitants had stored for winter. Tools, too, would have been lost, and it's not very likely they could just pop down to the nearest store to pick up a new set. Vital fishing boats would have been destroyed. Many of the community's hunters might have been dead or injured, and perhaps even entire oral histories were lost when the older folk drowned. Creatures living in the coastal waters would have been badly impacted too, destroying the most immediate source of food these devastated communities had. In short, surviving may have been worse than dying, and it's now thought many of the initial survivors died from the after effects during the winter. But even those who made it through to spring weren't out of the woods. In Denmark, there's some archaeological evidence that communities hit by the tsunami turned to warfare in the aftermath to win enough resources to survive. It's possible, if not likely, that something similar happened in Britain and Doggerland. If it did, then the first few years after the catastrophe were likely so grim they'd make 2020 look like a year of candy floss and unicorns. It's interesting to imagine how it must have felt to live through these desperate times, how it must have felt to have your perspective so fundamentally altered, the sea going from a benign source of food to a tyrant god capable of devouring your entire world. In the Chinese sci-fi trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, there's a character who becomes terrified of the sun, unable to even go outside in daytime after he discovers its sheer destructive potential. Who knows if these long-forgotten humans came to feel the same way about the ocean? In the end, it's thought that Britain's population took several centuries to recover. To give you some perspective, a quarter of Britons dying would have been equivalent to about 16.5 million people being wiped out today. But life goes on, and recover people did. Even Doggerland recovered, at least for a while. For a long time, it was thought that the Storegga tsunami marked the moment Doggerlands vanished forever beneath the waves.
I mean, I at no point thought this was going to have any permanent effect on even humanity on the British Isles. Permanent effect as in wiping out people. I think it might have. It obviously killed so many people and would have been horrific and awe-inspiring, awing. Awesome to see, I guess, and not like the, oh, that's awesome, just the definition of the word. But humans are incredibly adaptive, and so climate in the future, I have no doubt. Look, I don't know that much, but events like this could have drastic effects on people. But in terms of humanity surviving, I have no doubt that humans would survive even a nuclear catastrophe.
But nowadays,
it could go down to nothing. But in terms of being wiped out, I don't think that is it'd be very difficult outside of like a meteor.
It's thought the land survived the catastrophe, its landscape altered, but not annihilated. However, it couldn't survive what was to come next. As the glaciers continued to melt and the sea levels kept on rising, Doggerland, at last, became uninhabitable. As the waters rushed over its surface, cutting Britain off from Europe forever, its desperate people migrated en masse to the island. There's even a theory that
there are a lot of Brits smiling at that sentence.
Descendants of the Doggerlanders who settled Orkney off the coast of Scotland and built the Great Stone Age structures there. Around 5,500 BC, the last traces of Doggerland sank for good. By then, all memories of the gigantic wave that caused so much chaos had probably faded away. It had been a one-off event, a freak accident that had killed many, but was far from a regular occurrence. Or was it? Given how destructive the North Sea tsunami was, scientists today are struggling to answer a chilling question. Could it happen again?
Well, I would think that at the beginning stages of the melt of the Ice Age, there is much more ice, and the world is probably changing much faster at the beginning stages of the ice age than it is right now, because we're technically still in the ice age. Am I correct? And so I just feel like the potential energy of things collapsing into the sea is minuscule compared to what it was, but I'm sure there are some examples around the world of permafrost places near coasts where if ice on top of it would continue to melt. Maybe in like Greenland, maybe it could threaten Iceland or Scotland, Northern Ireland, maybe parts of North America. But I mean, the potential energy of all this is got to be minuscule compared to what it was in the beginning stages of the ice age. Right?
If you live in Britain, your experience with tsunamis is probably relegated solely to news reports from other nations. Despite being surrounded by water, Britain rarely suffers from the ocean in the same way that Japan does. Sure, occasionally some massive storms might brew up and wash away a load of coastal roads and rail tracks, as happened during the winter of 2013, but by and large, the chances of watching your house gaily sailing away atop a wave are roughly zero, or so we Brits like to believe. However, go digging into the historical record and you'll find more waves than you might expect. The greatest of these was likely the one that hit the Bristol Channel in early 1607 or late 1606 under the old Julian calendar. On January the 30th, floodwaters suddenly swept up the channel from the Atlantic, drowning entire villages and washing away herds of livestock. The inundation killed around 2,000 people and left its mark on churches and old stone bridges across the region. But while a tsunami is suspected as being the cause, a storm surge can't be ruled out. Things are more certain where the Cornwall tsunami is concerned.
Right, because I know the Bristol Inlet is in the southwest of England on the coast. Is it the Irish Sea? In the sea where the Isle of Man is, in between Ireland and Great Britain, and the British island. And so I don't see the potential of like a Norway permafrost mudslide tsunami happening.
55, an offshore earthquake leveled the Portuguese city of Lisbon while also sending tsunami waves shooting out in all directions. One of these impacted southern Cornwall. While no one actually counted the number killed, it was declared that there was great loss of life. So tsunamis and Britain, while rarely seen together, are not total strangers. But there are two other tsunamis in Britain's geological record, and frighteningly, they hit exactly where the North Sea tsunami did. Around 3000 BC, and then again in 500 AD, Shetland was hit by two tsunamis at least 12 meters high.
I love that name,
in each
Shetland.
case, what caused them is a bit of a mystery, but it does seem to show killer waves devastating Scotland are not quite rare enough. That being said, the chances of a tsunami battering Britain in your lifetime are extremely small, almost unimaginably so. But, and this is a big but, that's not the same thing as those chances being zero. Thanks to climate change, there are currently processes taking place beneath the North Sea that could potentially spell destruction. As in the run-up to the Storegga slide, trapped methane in places like Greenland could well be melting, even as local glaciers retreat. As the 21st century grinds on, we may find the combination triggers earthquakes, leading to submarine landslides. While these slips would almost certainly be too small to cause many noticeable effects, there is an outside chance that a Storegga-sized event could happen again. If it does, all bets are off. Were this new slip to take place near Svalbard or Greenland, it would send a cascade of water hurtling towards Scotland unseen since that fateful autumn day 8,000 years ago. Waves taller than 10 meters could come crashing into Edinburgh and Newcastle, causing destruction on a massive scale. Bridges would be swept away, cars would be picked up and carried like toys. Fires would break out, smaller buildings would crumble and break, and everywhere people would be caught up in the water's embrace, killed as surely as if they'd stepped in front of a freight train. If you've ever watched the footage of the Japanese tsunami sweeping inland, you'll know what horrors to expect. The slow-moving wall of death, the flood that obliterates roads and rail tracks, the untold numbers dying. Thankfully, though, this nightmare scenario remains.
Those waves of tsunami waves going inland, they look like, oh, wow, that's not moving that fast. You can probably get away. It doesn't look so crazy. But as the helicopter images kind of go closer and closer and you start seeing it really moving and just see these cars like little toys just like rolling more and more terrifying.
It's purely hypothetical. While the San Andreas Fault or the Cascadia earthquake will certainly unleash chaos at some point in the next century or two, the next great North Sea tsunami may never come. It could be that another 8,000 years from now, our distant descendants are still waiting for that next great wave. But that won't change the fact that the real disaster already happened. 8 millennia ago, the peoples of two regions were forced to watch as everything they held dear was destroyed. It was a cataclysm on par with anything in modern history. The Titanic, 9/11, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, they all pale compared to this ancient catastrophe. The main difference is that we were able to record those other tragedies, to write articles and make videos, to record our stories so the disaster wouldn't be forgotten. In the case of the North Sea tsunami, no such records existed. Nothing survived to tell us how it felt to be those ancient hunters watching their world crumble around them. Nothing but a layer of sediment in the geological record, waiting patiently for someone to decode something that finally happened in our lifetimes. Now, at long last, the story of that bygone tsunami's victims can be told, their forgotten suffering finally understood. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting. If
I did, for sure.
you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.
So a great video, by the way. Awesome. I did not know about it, and I learned a lot, and that was very enjoyable. I think I paused a lot, but whatever. All right. But I feel like it can't happen again and again. This is just my opinion. I know I'm no geologist or climate scientist or expert in. All right. But it seems like the only way it would happen again is if we entered a new ice age and all of this ice built up, and then we entered a thawing and started to warm up again, and then it could happen again. Because it seems like right when you said, could this happen again, my brain went immediately to, well, like imagine you have this big igloo, right? And like you're around like imagine you have this big igloo and it starts to thaw and all of the destruction happens as it caves in and everything, but as it continues to thaw and it then becomes just like a circular mound of snow. I'm finishing this even though I don't think it's a great analogy. Then there's less potential for it to cave in and whatnot, and there's less destruction, you know? And so as the world is much more thawed now, Greenland, I think of Greenland, maybe it could happen there or on some of the Canadian Nunavut Islands or on Antarctica for sure, Antarctica maybe. Yeah, so maybe Antarctica could like threaten South Africa or Tasmania, Australia, Patagonia maybe. Yeah, all right. That great video, awesome. See you guys next time. See ya.